This lesson is all about auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs are sometimes called helper verbs or helping verbs. And the main auxiliary verbs we're looking at in this lesson are be, do, and have. Now, there are also modal auxiliary verbs. They have their own lessons, so please refer to that lesson for all information on modal auxiliary verbs. The auxiliary verbs can also function as the main verb in a sentence, which sometimes makes them difficult to understand and use. The be is used to form the passive voice. Be and have are used as auxiliaries for verb aspects. Do is used to negate main verbs or to ask questions. When we look at the passive formation, we use the verb to be. John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. The shop is usually opened by the manager. Generous donations are being sent to the charity fund. Now, for more information on active and passive voice, please see that lesson for more details. I would like to point out, though, that in using the passive voice, the verb to be has to be conjugated correctly for the subject, and you can see that in these examples. So, to be and to have are used as auxiliaries for verb aspects. So, to be is used to form the continuous aspect. Have is used to form the perfect aspect. And both are used together to form perfect continuous aspects. And again, the verbs must be correctly conjugated here. There is a whole section on tenses and aspects, so please refer to that for more information. We'll still look at some examples in this lesson though. So to be is used to form the continuous aspect. We need to conjugate the verb correctly for the tense that is being used. So Paul was working the night shift last week. That's a past tense sentence. James was not working nights. That's a past tense with a negative. My parents are visiting us now. Present tense. And a future tense, I will be leaving early tomorrow. Please see the appropriate lessons in the tenses and aspects section for more information. We use the verb to have to form perfect aspects. And we have to correctly conjugate to have for the tense being used. I had worked as a programmer before moving to sales. So that's the past perfect form. Jane has lived in London all her life. That's the present perfect. And a future perfect example, John will have finished his report by Thursday. Or if we negate that, Eddie won't have finished his report by then, where won't is the concatenated form of will not. We use to be and to have together to form the perfect continuous aspects. And we need to correctly conjugate these as well. We look at a past perfect continuous. We had been working 14 hours a day. Present perfect continuous. Tom has been trying to get in touch with you all week. If we negate the present perfect continuous, Bill hasn't been looking for a new job, where hasn't is the concatenation of has not. Then a future perfect continuous example. Next year, Joe will have been working here for 25 years. And we use the verb to do to negate main verbs. So if the main verb hasn't already got an auxiliary verb with it, as we've seen in some of the previous examples, we use to do to negate it. So we conjugate the verb to do, add a not, and then add the main verb in its base form. So we don't conjugate the main verb anymore. And the verb to be, as is not a surprise to you, is an exception and can just simply be negated with not. Now look at some examples of negation. So we use to do, conjugated, plus not, and then the main verb in its base form, i.e. unconjugated form. So Peter works in a restaurant. Now if we said just add not, Peter works not in a restaurant, that's just incorrect, and we don't say that. Say Peter does not work in a restaurant, or here the abbreviated form of doesn't work in a restaurant. Or another example, Penny lived in the city. If we just try to add a simple not, we get Penny lived not in the city, which is incorrect. We don't say that. Say Penny didn't live in the city. And this is a past tense example. So we need didn't. As we've seen in other places, the verb to be is an exception, and we can simply negate it with a not. So Polly is late for work. Polly isn't late for work, where isn't is the concatenation of is and not. That's the present tense. Look at the past tense. Joan was first in her class, or Joan wasn't first in her class, where wasn't is was not. And the future tense is shown here really just for completeness. The future tenses are formed in a different way. We have Don will be here soon, or Don won't be here soon, where won't is the concatenation of will not. We also use do to ask questions. So if the main verb hasn't already got an auxiliary verb, as we've seen in previous examples, we use do for the question form. So we conjugate and invert the verb to do, and then add the main verb in its base form. So we don't conjugate the main verb anymore. And the verb to be is of course an exception, and we can simply invert it to make the question. So we use do to ask questions. So Peter works in a restaurant. Now if we just try and invert it, i.e. switch around the verb and the subject, we would have works Peter in a restaurant, and that's just wrong. We don't say that. So we strike through that, and we use does Peter work in a restaurant. That's a present tense example. Or we say Penny lived in the city, and if we just try a simple inversion, we get lived Penny in the city, which is not correct. We don't say that. We say did Penny live in the city, and because it's a past tense, we have to make do a did. And of course the verb to be is an exception, and we can simply invert subject and verb to make a question. So past tense example of a statement would be you were here yesterday, and as a question, were you here yesterday? We just swap the first two words around. That's the inversion. Or a present example, you are happy, and as a question, are you happy? And again, a future tense just for completeness, you will be fine on the day. Will you be fine on the day?